Welcome back, everybody. This is GDS. Before we start this video, I want you to go to the blah blah below and let me know whether or not you think that we as GMs need to create explicitly a narrative when we run our games. This is a small channel. I don't get many comments, so if you comment below, I'm going to see it, I'm going to heart it, I'm going to respond to it, so let's get a conversation going. So, creating a narrative. Do we need to create a narrative? There are many games I've run which have no intentional narrative. It's just me and my players, and I respond to what my players do. If that's what you like to do, that's fine. Just feel free to skip the first half of this video. However, keep in mind that there is always a de facto narrative. A narrative that emerges as a matter of fact when you play the game. As you play the game, there is the story of what happened in the game. That is the narrative. There is always a story of what happened, whether it's intentional or not. The popular issue that I see with narratives when online GMs post their campaigns and ask, does this sound like a good campaign? Is that the GM only makes plot. They only make a series of events that happen whether or not the players are there, and then the players are dropped into it. I think this is not the optimal way to have fun with tabletop RPGs, because what makes tabletop RPGs special as opposed to something like writing is that you create a premise as the GM, and the players surprise you with the kind of decisions they make. In that way, as the GM, you are not the only person creating the narrative. The players are co-authors in the narrative that you're all making together. So if we are enlightened GMs, then we go with this advice. We want our games to be heavily determined by the players. Great. The difficult thing about this is that we can't predetermine what happens next. But campaigns, which is a series of adventures with the same heroes, are difficult to run because they're the same heroes playing through a whole overarching series of adventures. So how do we plan for this campaign when it has to be player-driven and not predetermined? I'm going to give you a summary of writing philosophy that has been popularized, if not invented, by Brandon Sanderson. He is a fantasy author, and if you have some extra time, I recommend you look up his name on YouTube because he has many university-grade lectures that he gives offered for free. So, according to Brandon Sanderson, narrative is composed of three things, 3 Ps. It's got promises, progress, and payoff. Promises can be a number of things. In the context of games and tabletop RPGs, they are the fantasy from the schema of fantasy goal mechanic that I outlined in many of my videos. If you're curious, here or here. The promise of a fantasy. For example, when you think about, say, a Western, what kind of themes, ideas, and feelings are evoked when you think about that? What kind of moments come to your mind? Other types of promises that can come up is promises of tone. For example, is this a high fantasy, crazy kitchen sink fantasy RPG? Or is this a dark, grim RPG? Is this maybe a Call of Cthulhu in New York RPG? Those all have distinct tones that are communicated in the beginning of the game and in the beginning of your sessions. Other things that can be promised are plot archetypes. For example, everybody knows the heist. You know, somebody is planning a heist and they go and they gather individuals with different skills, etc. Other common archetypes is the little guy versus the big guy, like in Star Wars, the Rebels versus the Empire, and also the hunt for the MacGuffin, where you're looking for something and you have to go get it. Another type of promise that can occur is the promise of a plot, which is what kind of things are going to happen. For example, if in the beginning of your book or in the beginning of your campaign, someone is given a quest to, say, go to the east and speak to an expert, you know that there is going to be some travel involved. So those are promises. They can fall into those categories or maybe be different categories that you can think about, but there are things that you outline, as I said, in the beginning of the game or the beginning of a session that, for the lack of a better word, promise the readers or players something that they think is cool that will be fulfilled. The next P is progress, which is basically progress towards the promise. A quick example of this is if a promise you have is we need to travel east to speak to an expert, progress will be literally making progress along that journey physically. Typically in stories in general, but also in tabletop RPGs, I think Progress should be signposted with explicit moments or achievement that symbolize the progress that's being made. Oftentimes, when a book, if you're an author, or when a game, if you're a GM, feels boring, like nothing is happening, is because the author or GM made promises in the beginning, but shows little or no progress towards them. So in order for your players to feel accomplished, or for the readers of the book you're writing to feel like stuff is happening that's interesting, you have to show and signpost progress towards their promises. The last P is payoff. It's basically cool things that fulfill the fantasies, the promises you establish in the beginning, and payoffs need to be earned. They are earned with progress. In the context of tabletop RPGs, it's easy to see how this structure happens throughout the arc of a campaign, but there can also be sub-narratives within the central arc of the campaign. For example, the overarching narrative of something like Star Wars is Empire versus the Rebels. A subplot can be something like Luke learning to use the Force. But speaking of tabletop RPGs, let's talk about how all of this narrative things that work so well for fiction translate to when you run the game. I think the big difference, like we mentioned before, is that a tabletop RPG, if you do it right, is determined by the players. So when you write a novel, you're in full control of the narrative. But when you run a tabletop RPG, you have all these co-authors that are also in control of the narrative, and they can surprise you by the choices they make. We also, if we use this method of outlining, want to avoid railroading. If we start with a payoff, which is a good way to do it if you're writing a book, and say, this is my payoff, what kind of progress would I need to make in order to earn this payoff? And then where would I start? What would be my promise? If we worked backwards in this way towards an inevitable conclusion, it would be railroading, because we would be pushing the players towards a pre-made conclusion regardless of what it is they do. I think the solution then is not to work backwards as you would when you're writing a book, but to work forwards. Make the promises and show progress, lay the tracks out in front of the train as it's going. Let me explain. 1. Every narrative or sub-narrative should begin with a promise. Promises, again, like we said, can be tones, fantasy, and plot archetypes, stuff like that. 2. Every session give players opportunities, i.e. quests or adventures, to make progress along the promises that you made. Promises that you control, like stuff happening in the background between factions, you can just show progress on by yourself. 3. As you run the game and the players do whatever it is they do and completely derail your plan, a small number of possible satisfying outcomes, payoffs, will begin to emerge. Figure out what those are and be ready for whichever way the players end up going. I understand this can sound abstract, so let me break this down for you with this example. Let me read off my notes here. Imagine this first session. The players are tasked by the Adventurers Guild with traveling east to stop a goblin attack on a small settlement. After several days of journey where they survive the wilderness, they arrive at the settlement. There, they fight off a group of goblins, which they learn are the Red Hand clan. The player characters fight well, but are slowly beginning to become overwhelmed by the sheer number of goblins. Then, suddenly, they realize that they are surrounded by a completely different clan of goblins that they learn is the Black Skull, because they have a symbol of a black skull on them or something. But these goblins are different. They're really organized. They're well armed. As soon as they realize they are surrounded, the goblins that have been fighting the players, the Red Hand clan, drop their weapons and fall to their knees. From the ranks of the Black Skull emerges a goblin, slightly taller than the other goblins and wearing a crown. This is the Goblin King. He finds and executes the leader of the Red Hand clan that's been leading this raid. He speaks eloquently with the players. The players have never seen a goblin speak like this. He apologizes to the players for the behavior of the Red Clan, and then he goes to the dead leader of the Red Hand, chops off his ear, and adds it to a long necklace of ears along his neck. The Goblin King, with another ear on his necklace, tells the players to leave. He has no quarrel with them, but he says they should know this area now belongs to him, to his consolidated Goblin Kingdom. When the players return to town and maybe ask the Guildmaster about this, the Guildmaster says that there are many rumors about the Goblin King. People say he's part human, can read minds, knows magic, and rides a dragon into battle. Who knows if any of these are true? Let's break down this hypothetical first session and look at what promises, progress, and potential payoff we can see in the future. Promises. We definitely had promises of tone. We had a journey through the wilderness that is dangerous and requires survival skills. So in this game, the vibe is that the wilderness is dangerous and traveling through it is not trivial. Possible progress that players might be able to make towards this promise is mapping out the wilderness, literally making a map and figuring out what's out there, creating roads between settlements or outposts to provide safety. Another tone promise that I think this makes is that this is a more or less classic D&D game with goblins and goblin kings and dragons. So progress towards this promise can be leveling up, becoming more powerful, meeting more iconic enemies. Another tone promise, there seem to be several goblin clans and they definitely don't all agree, so there could be some politicking involved. Players can make progress in this, for example, by pitching the goblin clans against one another. Another tone promise is that the Goblin King is weird. He's unusual. The players have never seen a goblin like this. Progress towards this promise can be learning more about the Goblin King, how he became this way. What is he? What are his abilities? What does he do? What does he want? More promises that this session makes is regarding plot archetypes. I think the archetype here is dealing with a mounting threat. In this case, the Goblin King and his army in the east. The progress towards this can be that the Goblin King is slowly consolidating more and more goblin tribes and is becoming a threat to human civilization. As he does this, maybe the players spy on him and learn his plans and make their own plans and maybe defensive fortifications and stuff like that. The thing about these promises is that players can choose whichever ones they want to interact with. And when they do, you figure out what progress makes sense, prep that for the next session, and when they get far enough along, make enough progress, you figure out a potential payoff. For example, as the players learn more about the mounting threat of the Goblin King, maybe they do a really good job of spying, preparing, pitching the clans against one another, and then there is an epic final battle of human civilization against the Goblin King, and the players use everything they've learned and prepared to win that battle. That's everything I have for today. I hope that was useful for you in some way, or at least interesting. That's how I think we can take fictional narrative principles and apply them to running the game. If you like this video and you're using a touchscreen, I want you to touch the like button and the subscribe button with your nose vigorously. Smash your face into those buttons. If you're already subscribed, an even number of times on the subscribe button and an odd number of times on the like button. If you're not subscribed, do an odd number of times on both. I'm going to leave the specific numbers up to you. This is player agency this time. We have a Discord, which is not a secret. It's in the nonsense below. Come click it, join the conversation. It's a small community. Say hi, I'll be there. I'll answer your questions, or maybe you can tell me I'm wrong about everything and bad. That's pretty much it. I'll see you later.